It was a Tuesday afternoon in May, the kind of day that stretches long and heavy in Los Angeles, where the sun beats down relentlessly and time seems to move differently in hospital rooms. The world outside continued its business, unaware that inside Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, one of entertainment's greatest legends was fading away. Sammy Davis Jr., the man who had danced across stages for 60 years, who had overcome racism with a smile and talent that couldn't be denied, was dying. His voice, once capable of belting out songs that would make audiences weep, had been reduced to barely a whisper by the cancer eating away at his throat. Altaviz, Sammy's wife, sat vigil by his bed at Cedars-Sinai, watching the man she had married 20 years ago on their anniversary just days ago slowly disappear into the machines that kept him breathing. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had lived for performance, for the spotlight, for standing on stage and commanding an audience of thousands, was now confined to a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and IV lines. In his private room, Sammy lay connected to machines, his once powerful voice reduced to barely audible whispers, his legendary energy fading with each labored breath. The strong-willed entertainer who had broken barriers in an industry that had fought him at every turn now found himself fighting a battle he couldn't win with charm or talent or determination. Sammy had been diagnosed with throat cancer back in August of 1989, just months after completing a grueling tour with Frank Sinatra and Liza Minnelli called The Ultimate Event. When the doctors first told him about the tumor, they had offered him surgery as his best option for survival. A laryngectomy. They would remove part of his larynx, remove the very instrument that had made him one of the greatest entertainers in the world. But Sammy Davis Jr. had never been a man to accept what others told him to do. Not when it came to something he cared about. He refused the surgery. He chose radiation therapy instead, determined to keep his voice, even if that determination cost him his life. The 8 weeks of radiation left his skin discolored and raw, so raw that blood would seep from it when he touched his throat. But he endured it, believing that the cancer was in remission, holding on to hope that he might somehow return to performing. But hope and reality have a way of colliding, and in the months that followed, the cancer had crept back. In February of 1990, just weeks before his death, Sammy had appeared at his 60th anniversary celebration in show business. It was a 2.5-hour television special broadcast on February 4th, hosted by Eddie Murphy and featuring virtually every major star in entertainment paying tribute to him. Michael Jackson was there. Whitney Houston performed. Frank Sinatra came and spoke about his little friend, the best friend he ever had. Dean Martin was there too, honoring a man who had stood beside him through decades of performances and personal struggles. Sammy, frail and weak, his voice barely a whisper, had managed to rise from his chair and perform a brief soft shoe routine, and the audience had given him a standing ovation. It was a moment of grace, a final celebration before the cancer took its final toll. By March, Sammy was back in Cedars-Sinai. The cancer had recurred, and this time there was no denying it. His larynx had to be removed. They performed the surgery on him, but even that couldn't stop what was happening. He was released from the hospital on March 13th, but he was a different man than he had been before. The surgeries, the radiation, the disease itself had taken everything out of him. By May 13th, the media had descended on Summit Drive in Beverly Hills. Over 300 journalists from around the world had jammed the street outside Sammy's home. They trampled gardens and blocked traffic. Neighbors called the police. They all knew Sammy Davis Jr. was dying, and they wanted to be there to capture his final moments. But inside that house, behind closed doors and away from the cameras, something else was happening. Something more important. Something that had to do with loyalty and brotherhood and the bonds that had held the Rat Pack together through decades of change and tragedy. Dean Martin had heard about Sammy's condition, of course. By this time in his own life, Dean was broken in ways the public didn't fully understand. 3 years earlier, on March 21st, 1987, Dean had been on stage at Bally's Casino in Las Vegas, performing in front of 5,000 people. He was singing "Everybody Loves Somebody" when his manager appeared at the side of the stage, holding a phone. The song died on Dean's lips. His face went pale. He had just been told that his son, Dean Paul Martin, known as Dino Jr., or the Golden Boy, had been killed in a military jet crash. His F-4 Phantom II had gone down in the San Bernardino Mountains during a routine training exercise. His son was only 35 years old. Dean had dropped the microphone and walked off stage without a word, and the audience thought it was part of the show. But backstage, the king of cool had shattered. He never fully recovered from that moment. So when Altovise asked Frank Sinatra if Dean might visit Sammy, Frank had replied with the brutal honesty of a man who knew his friends intimately. "Dean doesn't do deathbeds," Frank had said. "It's not that he doesn't care about you. It's not that he won't come. Dean's got your back," Frank used to say. "He just doesn't talk about it." But as the days of May grew shorter and Sammy's time grew shorter still, Dean found himself thinking about his friend. He found himself remembering all the moments they had shared together. The late-night conversations in Vegas hotel suites, where they would sit and talk about everything and nothing. The practical jokes they would play on each other. In 1955, when Sammy Davis Jr. was a young performer just beginning to make his name in Las Vegas, the city itself was a hostile place for him. Las Vegas was segregated. Las Vegas was, in fact, so strictly segregated that it was known as the Mississippi of the West. Sammy could perform at the hotels on the Strip. He could make audiences laugh and cry and cheer with his talent, but he couldn't stay at those hotels. He couldn't eat in the dining rooms. He couldn't use the guest restrooms. He had to enter through the kitchen dock, walk past the steaming laundry rooms and the stench of grease and onions, and exit next to the dumpsters where the garbage rotted in the desert heat. Every night, he had to be driven miles away from the Strip to West Las Vegas, a dilapidated, segregated neighborhood, where the roads weren't paved and the air conditioning was a luxury. He slept in a boarding house, while Frank and Dean slept in penthouse suites with silk sheets. This was the Las Vegas deal, and Sammy had learned to smile through the humiliation. But Dean Martin wasn't the kind of man who could smile through that kind of injustice. By 1954, when Frank Sinatra had specifically requested that the Will Maston Trio open for him at the Sands Hotel, and Sammy had become the first African-American performer to be offered a complimentary room and access to the casino on the Strip, things had begun to change. Frank had demanded it. Frank had made it clear that if they wouldn't welcome his friend, then he wouldn't perform there either. And when Dean saw what Sammy endured, the way the light would fade from his eyes each night after performing, something hardened in Dean. He watched Sammy forced to eat cold food in his dressing room, because he wasn't allowed in the dining room. He watched him shrink. And that's when Dean Martin decided that the show was over. Years later, in February of 1960, when they were filming Ocean's 11 together, the 5 Rat Pack members were at the height of their power. Frank, Dean, Sammy, Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop were the most famous entertainers in the world. They were untouchable. But even their fame had limits when it came to segregation. Sammy was still not allowed to stay at the major hotels, still not allowed to sleep in the same beds that his friends slept in. He had to stay at Mrs. Harrison's boarding house, in the West Side. And Dean would remember that. Years later, he would remember exactly how that felt, watching his friend treated as less than, watching the racism that no amount of talent could overcome. Now, as Sammy lay dying in 1990, Dean thought about those moments. He thought about the time he had called Sammy at 3 a.m. because he was drunk and feeling sorry for himself, convinced that the Rat Pack was over, that the magic was gone, that they weren't a group anymore. Sammy had come over and sat with him until the sun came up. Dean remembered that night with perfect clarity. He had been contemplating walking away from show business entirely, questioning everything about his career and his friendships. But Sammy had told him something that had stuck with him all those years. Sammy had said that the music mattered more than the politics, that what they did on stage was pure, and that nothing could take that away from them. Sammy had reminded him that they weren't just entertainers, they were friends, and that was worth fighting for. So on the afternoon of May 14th, 1990, Dean Martin made a decision that would cost him emotionally, that would require him to face death and loss and grief in a way that he had been avoiding for 3 years. He got in his car and drove to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He wasn't sure he could do this. He had never been good at goodbye. He hated hospitals. He had a policy of not saying goodbye when he knew it would be the last time. But he went anyway, because Sammy was his friend, and that meant something. He walked quietly into Sammy's hospital room, and Altavice looked up, expecting to see a nurse. Instead, she saw Dean Martin, and her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, especially not at this late stage, especially not when Sammy was so close to the end. Dean looked older than Sammy remembered. He looked more fragile. The famous swagger was replaced by something tentative and careful. He had aged in a way that only grief could age a man. Dean approached the bed slowly, his eyes taking in his friend's condition. Sammy lay there, connected to machines, his breathing labored, his body wasting away. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Sammy's eyes opened, and he focused on his friend's face. "Dino," Sammy whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the machines keeping him alive. "Hey, Smokey," Dean replied, using the nickname he had given Sammy decades earlier. A name born out of affection and connection. "You look terrible." It was vintage Dean Martin humor, a way of breaking through the weight of the moment with lightness, even when there was nothing light about what was happening. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Sammy finally managed to say. His voice was so quiet that Dean had to lean in to hear him. Dean's expression softened, and he reached for Sammy's hand. "I wasn't sure I would either," Dean said quietly. "I'm not good at this stuff, Sam. You know that. But you're here now," Sammy said. "That's what matters." Dean reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something he had been carrying with him for weeks, something he had worked up the courage to bring with him on this day. It was a photograph. "I found this in my desk," Dean said, holding it where Sammy could see it. "I've been carrying it around for weeks, trying to work up the courage to come here." Sammy stared at the photograph, remembering the moment it was taken. It was a picture of the 5 Rat Pack members in their prime. It had been during the filming of Ocean's 11, and they had just finished a show at the Sands. It was 1961. And even though the Rat Pack was at the height of their power, even though they were the most famous entertainers in America, Sammy was still not allowed to stay at the hotel where they performed. That photograph represented everything they had fought for and everything they had failed to change about the world they lived in. "When they tried to make you use the service entrance," Dean continued, his voice growing thick with emotion, "I wanted to fight the whole hotel. But you just smiled and said, 'Let's show them how it's done.' You said, 'Dino, let's be so good they can't ignore us.'" Sammy remembered it. He had said that. He had believed it then. Believed that talent and determination and a smile could overcome the ugliness of racism. And maybe it had. In its own way. Maybe by refusing to accept the boxes that people tried to put him in. By being so undeniably brilliant that they couldn't ignore him. Sammy had broken down barriers. But it had cost him. Everything that he had achieved had cost him something. Dean paused, struggling with his emotions. This was the most vulnerable Sammy had ever seen, his friend, the king of cool, finally allowing himself to feel. "I know I wasn't always there when you needed support," Dean said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I could have spoken up more, done more. I was a coward sometimes, Sam. But I want you to know that every night we performed together was an honor for me." Sammy's eyes filled with tears. He thought about the times when Dean had been there, really there, in ways that mattered. He thought about a moment many years ago, during the Kennedy administration, when political tensions had begun to divide the Rat Pack. The connection with the Kennedy family was intoxicating and powerful, but it had also created divisions among the friends. Sammy remembered being in a dark place, feeling like the magic was slipping away. Like the group that had meant so much to him was dissolving under the weight of egos and ambitions and the complexities of politics and power. He had been ready to quit, ready to walk away from all of it. He had felt like they weren't a group anymore, like the magic was gone. That was when he had called Dean in the middle of the night, 3 a.m, drunk and despairing and completely lost. Dean paused, remembering that difficult time when the Rat Pack's association with the Kennedy administration had created tensions and divisions that threatened to tear them apart. "I called you that night," Dean said. "Remember? I was drunk and feeling sorry for myself, and I said I was done with show business." Sammy did remember. He had gotten out of bed, gotten in his car, and driven to Dean's house at 3 in the morning. And he had sat with his friend until the sun came up. They hadn't done anything special. They hadn't solved any problems or answered any questions. They had just sat together in the darkness, two friends holding onto each other while the world outside threatened to pull them apart. "You came over to my house," Dean continued, his voice growing stronger as he accessed the memory. "You came over at 3 in the morning, and you sat with me until the sun came up. You reminded me that the music mattered more than the politics. You said that what we did on stage was pure, and that nothing could take that away from us. You told me that we weren't just entertainers, Sam. We were friends, and that was worth fighting for." Dean's voice was barely a whisper now, but each word carried the weight of decades of friendship. "You saved our friendship that night, Sam. You saved me." And in that moment, sitting by Sammy's bed in a hospital room in Los Angeles, Dean Martin finally allowed himself to cry. And Sammy cried with him. Both men, legends in their own right, finally expressing emotions they had carried for decades. Emotions that had been buried under the weight of being the king of cool and the entertainer extraordinaire. They sat in silence for a moment, both men understanding that something profound was happening between them. Sammy said quietly, "You were the best friend a guy could have. I love you, too, Dino. Thank you for coming. Thank you for everything." Dean stayed for another hour, sharing memories and holding Sammy's hand. They talked about the performances, the laughter, the moments they had shared on stage when they could communicate with just a look or a gesture. They remembered the late-night conversations in Vegas hotel suites, the practical jokes they had pulled on each other, the way they had fought together against racism and injustice in an industry that seemed determined to hold them back. They talked about what it had meant to be part of the Rat Pack, to be part of something that transcended entertainment and became, in its own way, a statement about friendship and loyalty and brotherhood in a world that seemed increasingly cynical and divided. When Dean finally got up to leave, both men knew it was goodbye forever. But they didn't make it tragic. They didn't turn it into something maudlin or overly sentimental. Instead, Dean did what Dean Martin had always done in the face of real emotion. He made it lighter. He made it about the future, about the possibility of something beautiful still to come. "Hey, Sam," Dean said from the doorway. "Next time I see you, you better be ready to sing. I've got some new material I want to try out." Sammy managed a laugh, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep inside him, from a place where he was still a performer, still the entertainer who had danced and sung his way through impossible circumstances. "I'll be ready, partner," he said, his voice barely audible. "Save me the good songs." 2 days later, on May 16th, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 64 years old. Those who were close to him said that after Dean's visit, something had changed. The fear was gone. The panic that had been building as his body failed him had transformed into something like peace. He had received the blessing he needed from the friend whose opinion mattered most. The man who had stood beside him through decades of struggle and triumph and pain had come one last time to remind him that their friendship was real, that it had meant something, that it would transcend even death itself. Dean Martin attended Sammy's funeral on May 18th, 1990. It was one of the few times in his later years that he appeared at such an event. He didn't speak at the service, but he was there, honoring his friend one final time. He sat quietly while Stevie Wonder performed, and while the greatest entertainers in the world stood up to talk about what Sammy Davis Jr. had meant to them. But Dean didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. His willingness to be there, to face the grief and the loss, was his way of saying goodbye to the man who had been his brother in all but name. In the weeks and months that followed, when people asked Dean about that final conversation with Sammy, he would simply say, "We said what needed to be said." He would never elaborate. He would never make a big story out of it. That was the way Dean Martin was. The most important moments of his life were the ones he kept closest to his chest, the ones he refused to dramatize or exploit. His actions spoke louder than his words ever could. His presence at Sammy's bedside in that hospital room spoke to a loyalty and a brotherhood that had survived decades of change and tragedy, and the fundamental transformations that success and fame wreak upon even the strongest bonds. The photograph that Dean had brought with him to the hospital, the one showing the 5 Rat Pack members in their prime, was found on Sammy's nightstand after he died. It was placed there as a final tribute, a reminder of what they had all shared together. On the back of the photograph, in Dean's handwriting, were words that would become a final statement on the nature of their friendship. For Smokey, the best there ever was. Love, Dino. That photograph now sits in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a testament to a friendship that lasted beyond life itself, and proved that sometimes the most important words are the ones we almost never say, the ones we have to muster all our courage to speak, and the ones that mean everything, because they come from a place of authentic love and genuine connection. The funeral service for Sammy Davis Jr. took place on May 18, 1990, at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. It was a Friday morning, and despite the fact that Sammy had died just 2 days earlier, the entire entertainment industry seemed to converge on that small corner of California to pay their respects. The streets outside the cemetery were lined with television crews and photographers. The media had been relentless in the days following Sammy's death, and now they descended on his funeral like vultures, desperate to capture the grief and emotion of America's greatest entertainers. Inside the memorial chapel, over 2,000 people had gathered. They came from every corner of show business, from every generation, from every walk of life. Young performers, who had grown up watching Sammy Davis Jr. perform, sat next to legends who had shared stages with him for decades. Stevie Wonder was there, blind himself, and deeply moved by the loss of a man who had broken barriers for performers of color. Little Richard was there, tears streaming down his weathered face as he remembered the young Sammy Davis Jr., who had dared to dream when it seemed impossible to dream. Quincy Jones, the legendary producer and composer, sat in the front rows, remembering the man who had brought joy and meaning to so much music. And Dean Martin was there, seated with Frank Sinatra, both men looking older than anyone had ever seen them. Frank had organized the funeral service, had made the calls to get the biggest names in entertainment there. But it was Dean who looked as though he might break at any moment. He wore dark sunglasses, even though the service was indoors, even though there was no sun inside that chapel. Beside him, Frank maintained his composure, but his jaw was clenched. His hands gripped the pew in front of him with enough force that his knuckles had turned white. The program included tributes from Jerry Lewis, who spoke about losing his brother of 45 years, his voice cracking as he described what it meant to lose not just a friend, but family. Stevie Wonder performed, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the same grace and feeling that Sammy had brought to his own performances. There were moments of laughter, because that's what Sammy would have wanted. Moments that celebrated his life and his gifts, rather than dwelling solely on his absence. But there were also moments of profound silence. Moments when the chapel seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the enormity of what had been lost. When the service concluded, as the crowd began to file out of the chapel into the California sunshine, something happened that would become legendary among those who witnessed it. Dean Martin, who had maintained his composure throughout the entire service, who had sat stone-faced through every tribute and every prayer, suddenly seemed to collapse inward. His shoulders sagged. His face, hidden behind those dark sunglasses, seemed to break apart. Frank Sinatra, noticing his friend's distress, reached for him and held him as Dean Martin wept, finally allowing the grief that he had been carrying for so many years to break through that famous cool exterior. It was a moment that few people had ever seen. A moment that contradicted everything the world knew about Dean Martin. The king of cool was not cool anymore. He was a man who had lost too much, who had loved deeply and had been devastated by that love. In front of hundreds of people, in front of cameras and microphones and the entire machinery of Hollywood celebrity, Dean Martin let people see his pain. In the days and weeks that followed Sammy's death, Dean Martin retreated from public life. He gave a brief statement to the press, calling Sammy a great entertainer but an even greater friend, not only to himself but to everyone whose life he had touched. The words were measured and careful, controlled, the way Dean always spoke when he was trying to maintain his dignity. But those who knew him well could see that something fundamental had broken inside him. He had lost his son 3 years earlier. Now he had lost Sammy, the little brother he had protected and fought for, through decades of racism and injustice. It was too much. The weight of it was too much to carry. In June of 1990, Dean Martin made what would turn out to be his second-to-last public appearance. He performed at resorts in Atlantic City on June 2nd and 3rd. It was a performance that haunted everyone who witnessed it, because Dean Martin was not Dean Martin anymore. The magic was gone. The swagger was gone. What remained was a shell of a man, going through the motions of entertaining, but with no heart in it, no soul in it. The audiences could sense it. The joy that had always defined his performances, that light, careless way he had of making everything seem effortless and fun, was nowhere to be found. After that performance, he would never return to Atlantic City. He had played that city countless times over the decades, had formed a connection with audiences there. But he couldn't bring himself to go back. His final performances took place in Las Vegas around 1991. These were the performances that had defined his entire career. The shows that had made Las Vegas what it was in the eyes of the world. Las Vegas was Dean's city. He had discovered it as a young man, had helped transform it from a dusty desert town into the entertainment capital of the world. His shows at Bally's, at the Sands before it closed, at the other casinos and showrooms that had made Las Vegas famous, were the stuff of legend. People had stood in lines for hours to get tickets to see Dean Martin perform in Vegas. They had felt privileged to be in the same room as him, to witness the man who had seemed to have it all figured out, who knew exactly how to be cool, how to be in control, how to make everything seem easy. But by 1991, that magic had evaporated. Dean Martin was going through the motions. He was performing, singing the songs that had made him famous, telling the jokes that audiences expected. But there was no real connection between him and the audience anymore. There was no sense of a man who was enjoying himself, who was giving a gift to his audience, who was sharing something precious and irreplaceable. Instead, what people saw was a man who had given everything to his art, to his career, to his friendships, and who now had nothing left to give. After 1991, Dean Martin retired from performing almost entirely. He had become increasingly reclusive, increasingly withdrawn. He stopped answering the phone. He stopped seeing friends. He would sit in his home in Beverly Hills, surrounded by the trappings of a life that had been extraordinary, but unable to connect with any of it anymore. The house felt like a museum of his own accomplishments, filled with photographs and memorabilia that served as constant reminders of what he had been and what he had lost. He had lost his son. He had lost Sammy. He had lost his ability to perform, which had been the one thing that had given him purpose and meaning his entire life. Altavice Davis, Sammy's wife, would later say that Dean had been devastated by Sammy's death. She had watched them say goodbye in that hospital room, had seen the emotion and vulnerability on his face as he spoke to his dying friend. She knew that whatever had happened between them in that room, it had cost Dean something irreplaceable. After Sammy died, Dean seemed to lose the will to do much of anything. He had been holding on by a thread for 3 years after his son's death, performing because that's what he did, because that was who he was. But after Sammy died, that thread seemed to snap. In September of 1993, almost 3 years to the day after Sammy's death, Dean Martin received the diagnosis that many people who had known him for decades had been expecting. He was diagnosed with lung cancer at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He was a lifelong heavy smoker, had smoked since he was a young man, had made smoking part of his identity as the king of cool. The doctors told him that he would require surgery to have any chance of prolonging his life. But Dean Martin declined the surgery. He refused to fight. He refused to undergo the kinds of medical interventions that might have given him more time. He had spent 3 years watching his son's plane go down from a distance, unable to do anything about it. He had spent 8 months watching Sammy slowly fade away from cancer. He had spent 3 years living with the weight of those losses. He wasn't going to fight anymore. In early 1995, Dean Martin retired from public life completely. He was by this time a shadow of himself, weakened by emphysema, by the years of smoking, by the weight of grief and loss, and the simple exhaustion of still being alive when so many people he loved had died. He rarely left his home. He avoided seeing people. He didn't want visitors. The man who had spent his entire life entertaining, who had performed night after night for audiences all over the world, who had made a career out of connecting with people and making them laugh, now wanted nothing more than to be left alone. On Christmas Day, 1995, Dean Martin died in his sleep at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 78 years old. The official cause of death was listed as acute respiratory failure, which resulted from emphysema. But everyone who had known him understood that Dean Martin had died of a broken heart. He had been dying for 8 years, ever since that day in March of 1987 when his son's plane had crashed. Sammy's death had just been the final blow, the last thing that his fragile emotional structure couldn't support. Jerry Lewis, Dean's former partner, was reported to be completely shattered and grief-stricken by the news. He had lost his oldest friend, the man he had created comedy with, the man who had shaped his entire life. At Dean's funeral on December 28, 1995, at Pierce Brothers Cemetery in Westwood, California, Jerry Lewis gave a eulogy that was so emotionally powerful that he had to be supported by friends as he spoke. Frank Sinatra was too distraught to attend the funeral. The chairman of the board, the man who had led the Rat Pack, who had held the group together through decades of controversy and change, who had fought so hard to break down the barriers of segregation for Sammy Davis Jr., could not bring himself to say goodbye to yet another brother. Frank was still alive, but he was barely hanging on. He too had been diminished by the losses. In the years following Sammy's death, Frank had lost the spark that had defined him. He performed still, made occasional appearances, but the joy seemed to be draining out of him as well. The last time anyone would see Frank Sinatra perform was on February 25, 1995, at the Palm Desert Marriott Ballroom in California. It was a charity event for the Barbara Sinatra Children's Center, the foundation that Frank had established to help abused children. There were about 1,200 select guests, an intimate crowd, compared to the massive audiences that Frank had once commanded in arenas and concert halls across the world. He was 79 years old, and he was struggling with health issues that had become more pronounced over the years. But that night, he gave a performance that would become legendary as his final concert, his last chance to stand on a stage and sing. The setlist was a journey through his entire career. He sang, "I've Got the World on a String," that opening salvo that had defined his approach to life and music since the beginning. He sang, "You Make Me Feel So Young," a song that had once been an anthem of vitality and possibility. He sang, "Fly Me to the Moon," and "Where or When," songs that carried the weight of decades of memory and experience. He sang "My Kind of Town," another standard that had become synonymous with his name and legacy. And then, as the evening drew to a close, as the spotlight began to dim, he sang, "The Best Is Yet to Come." It was a song that had become synonymous with Frank Sinatra, a song about hope and possibility, and the future. When he finished, there was no grand announcement, no dramatic farewell. There was just a man and a microphone, and a lifetime of music distilled into one last performance. As the spotlight faded and the audience erupted in applause, Frank Sinatra sang the final line of that last song, "Excuse me while I disappear." And then, as his voice faded and the darkness enveloped the stage, Frank Sinatra left the stage for the last time. He would make a few brief appearances after that, most notably at his 80th birthday tribute in December of 1995. But this concert on February 25 would be remembered as his final true performance, the last moment that Frank would stand before an audience and give them the gift of his voice. 3 years later, on May 14, 1998, Frank Sinatra died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 82 years old, and he had lived long enough to watch nearly everything and everyone he had loved disappear. His final months were marked by a serious health crisis. He had suffered a heart attack that had left him weakened and diminished. Some experts who studied his life believed that emotional factors, particularly his anger and depression at the losses he had suffered, had contributed to his physical decline. He had been the leader of the Rat Pack, the man who had held them all together, who had made it work. But in the end, he couldn't hold on anymore. The weight of surviving when so many others had died was too much to bear. When Frank Sinatra died, it marked the end of an era. All 5 of the major Rat Pack members were now gone. Frank, the chairman of the board who had led the group and set the tone for their performances. Dean, the king of cool who had been the perfect foil for Frank's intensity. Sammy, the little man with the big voice who had broken through every barrier that the world had tried to put in his way. Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop had died years earlier. Their own lives marked by their association with the Rat Pack, but also limited by their willingness to step into the shadows when the spotlight was too bright. But the legacy that they left behind was something that could never be taken away. The Rat Pack had transformed Las Vegas from a dusty desert town into the entertainment capital of the world. They had set a standard for live entertainment that still resonates today. They had shown audiences what it meant to be confident, to be cool, to know how to connect with an audience and make them part of your world. But more importantly, in the case of Sammy Davis Jr., they had used their power and their influence to fight against racism and segregation, to break down barriers that had seemed impossible to break down. Sammy Davis Jr., he couldn't stay at the hotels where he performed. He couldn't eat in the restaurants. He couldn't use the bathrooms. But because of Frank Sinatra's insistence, because of Dean Martin's loyalty, because of their refusal to back down in the face of injustice, things began to change. In the years that followed Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr.'s passing, people began to understand the true magnitude of what the Rat Pack had accomplished, not just as entertainers, but as catalysts for social change. The story of that hospital room in May of 1990, when Dean visited Sammy for what would be the last time, became emblematic of something far larger than just a moment between 2 friends. It became a story about loyalty, about brotherhood, about using whatever power and privilege you have to fight for the people you love and the causes you believe in. The fact was, Sammy Davis Jr. had endured something that most Americans could never fully comprehend. He had grown up in a segregated America, where his talent meant nothing if the color of his skin was wrong. He had entered the military and experienced racism and brutality that had tested his spirit. He had come to Las Vegas in the 1,950 seconds, a place so thoroughly segregated that it earned the nickname the Mississippi of the West, and he had used his extraordinary gifts to crack open doors that seemed sealed shut forever. He performed at the most prestigious hotels on the Strip, but he couldn't sleep there. He couldn't eat in the dining rooms. He couldn't use the restrooms. Every single night, after giving everything he had on stage, after making audiences cry with laughter and joy, he had to exit through the kitchen, past the dumpsters, and the grease and the filth, and drive miles away to a boarding house in the segregated black neighborhood, because that was the law of Las Vegas. But Dean Martin couldn't accept that. Frank Sinatra couldn't accept that. And so they had used their power and their influence to change it. When Frank Sinatra had demanded that the Sands Hotel provide Sammy Davis Jr. with a room, with access to the casino, with the same privileges that the white performers received, he had made it clear that he would not perform there if they refused. And the casino owners, faced with the choice between their racist policies and losing the most bankable entertainment draw in the world, had chosen money over prejudice. It wasn't noble. It wasn't high-minded, but it worked. It was a crack in the wall, the first breach in the seemingly unbreakable barrier of segregation. And then, as word spread through Las Vegas that Sammy Davis Jr., he was staying at the Sands, that he had access to all the facilities, that the management was allowing it, other casinos began to realize that they could do it too. They could allow black guests and black employees without losing money. In fact, they might make more money by appealing to a broader audience. And slowly, gradually, casino by casino, Las Vegas began to integrate. It wasn't because of ideology or principle. It was because the Rat Pack made it fashionable, made it cool, made it impossible to refuse. The Rat Pack showed America that integration was not something to fear, but something to embrace. Sammy Davis Jr. was credited by the NAACP with helping to integrate Las Vegas and Miami Beach through his refusal to perform at segregated venues and his insistence on staying at the same hotels where he performed. In 1968, he was awarded the Spingarn Medal by the NAACP for outstanding achievements by an African American. But his contributions to the civil rights movement were never fully recognized by history. He had participated in the March on Washington in 1963. He had raised money for civil rights organizations. He had used his fame and his platform to fight for equality. And yet, his legacy became shadowed by his later association with Richard Nixon and his complicated personal choices. But for those who understood what had really happened, for those who knew the story of Sammy Davis Jr. and the Rat Pack, it was clear that Sammy had been one of the great civil rights heroes of his generation. He had done it not through politics or legislation, but through the sheer force of his talent and his determination to refuse to accept the boxes that society tried to put him in. He had shown the world that a black man could be equally talented, equally entertaining, equally worthy of respect as any white performer. And in doing so, he had helped change America. Dean Martin's final visit to Sammy Davis Jr. in that hospital room had been his way of honoring that legacy. It had been his way of saying that the fight had meant something, that the friendship had been real, that the barriers they had broken down together would endure. When Dean had brought that photograph of the 5 Rat Pack members in their prime and placed it on Sammy's nightstand, he had been saying that this moment, this friendship, this brotherhood, was more important than any individual success or any personal achievement. The photograph that had been taken during the filming of Ocean's 11, that had captured a moment when 5 men from different backgrounds and different circumstances had come together to create something magical, would outlast all of them. The legacy of the Rat Pack extended far beyond entertainment. It showed that it was possible for people of different races to be genuine friends, to truly care about each other, to use their power and influence to help each other. It showed that brotherhood could transcend the artificial barriers that society tried to impose, and it showed that sometimes, the most important thing you can do for someone you love is simply to be there, to show up when it matters, to let them know that they are valued and loved. In 1976, 16 years before Sammy Davis Jr. would die, there had been another moment of profound significance. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, who had not spoken to each other in 20 years, were reunited on live television during Jerry Lewis's Labor Day telethon. Their breakup in 1956 had been bitter and painful, and for 2 decades they had refused to acknowledge each other. But Frank Sinatra, the man who understood the power of friendship and the importance of reconciliation, had arranged for Dean to surprise Jerry on the telethon. When Dean walked out onto the stage, Jerry Lewis was shocked. The 2 men, who had created some of the greatest comedy in entertainment history, who had loved each other and had fought each other, were standing face to face again. The reunion was awkward at first. They both seemed nervous, unsure of what to say or do. But then they began to communicate in the language they had always understood best, the language of comedy and timing and nonverbal connection. They made each other laugh. They touched each other's faces. They embraced. And Jerry Lewis cried. He cried because he realized that 20 years of anger and bitterness and separation had been wasted when what he really wanted was to be with his friend again. Both men claimed that after that reunion, they spoke to each other every day for the rest of their lives. They had found their way back to each other, not because the anger had disappeared, but because they had realized that the friendship was more important than the pain. Dean Martin had given Jerry Lewis the gift of reconciliation, just as he had given Sammy Davis Jr. the gift of loyalty and friendship in those final moments in the hospital. The king of cool, a man who had spent his entire life maintaining a distance from emotional truth, had learned, in the final decades of his life, the importance of connection and reconciliation and showing up for the people you loved. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, just 8 months after Sammy's death, and 5 months after Frank Sinatra's final performance, it seemed like the end of an era. The men who had defined cool, who had shown the world how to live with confidence and style, who had broken down barriers and changed America, were gone. But the lessons they had taught remained. The example they had set remained. The friendship that had transcended race and class, and every artificial barrier that society tried to impose remained. If this story made you feel the warmth of true friendship, drop a comment. Also subscribe and like this video to see more future insightful videos like this. Looking forward to seeing you on the next one.